Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be speaking with Dr. Anders Sandberg. Anders is currently a research fellow with the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on global catastrophic risk, cognitive enhancement, collective intelligence, neuroethics, and much more. Anders serves as an advisor to Humanity Plus and has a background in computer science, neuroscience, and medical engineering. He obtained his Ph.D. in computational neuroscience with a focus on neural network modeling of human memory from Stockholm University in Sweden, which is the country he's originally from. This is a wide-ranging conversation in which we discuss existential risk, the possibility of alien life, the vulnerable world hypothesis, and much more. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support. Or you can purchase some of our newly released products at futuregrind.org/store. Because of you, this is Future Grind. All right, and now we are here with Anders. Anders, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you spend your days thinking about some very important topics: existential risks, bio and neuroethics, policy decisions, the Fermi Paradox, and much more. And we're going to get into all of that in this conversation. But first, what is your background and what got you interested in exploring these issues?
So once upon a time, I grew up in a fairly boring suburb of Stockholm in my native Sweden. And this was the 70s, so I went to the library and read all the science fiction novels I could find. And then I realized, actually, I want to have these kind of futures. So how do I get there? I should probably read all the science books. And then, of course, I ran out of the local library and went to the slightly larger branch library, eventually the municipal library, and eventually I started hanging out at the university library. And basically, I got myself a very broad background. So technically, I'm a computer scientist, but I was doing computational neuroscience. So I read up a bit on neuroscience, a bit on psychology, a bit of medical engineering. I got into transhumanism, so I got very interested in various applications and philosophical implications. And the end result is that I'm an academic jack of all trades. I'm not terribly good at anything except making mathematical models of things, but I'm very good at talking to people in different disciplines, and that's kind of my trick.
So you are currently doing your research at the Future of Humanity Institute. What is the purpose of the FHI, and how did you end up there?
So FHI was founded in 2005 when James Martin donated a lot of money to Oxford University to set up his school. Basically, a lot of institutes in different departments working on important problems and trying to fix the world. Now, FHI has a particularly unusual remit because the goal is to think real long term, really look at the horizon and think about where are we going? What are the threats to human flourishing long term? What can we do about it? While many of the other institutes are way more practical. It's all about climate change, ethics in armed conflict, stem cells, nanotechnology, migration, and similar things. So the institute was headed back then, and still is, by Nick Bostrom, the famous transhumanist philosopher. And when he was setting this up, the first research project was about human enhancement. What are the social and ethical impact of that? So he needed to hire some people, and I managed to get the job. I usually joke that I didn't get the job because I'm a good philosopher. I'm not. I got high school philosophy to my name, but I certainly understand a bit about human enhancement and neuroscience, and I could do web design. And this is generally my academic trick. I can do a little bit of everything and connect the disciplines. So what we do at FHI is very much trying to figure out what are the most important questions, how can we figure out something about them, And then sometimes getting in on the object level, like, okay, can we reduce risk from artificial intelligence? Or finding meta level ideas about how can we approach these issues. So that includes also thinking about how well it's possible to think about weird futuristic questions, questions about priority setting, but also allows me to poke my nose into very practical questions like risks from nuclear war, or what's the likelihood that we would get certain technologies before certain other technologies.
So where does the funding for the FHI come from, and what are the deliverables or end products that you put out in the world, and who uses them?
So the original funding came from the Oxford Martin School. Since then, we've been getting funding from a lot of very different sources. So, for example, I'm right now on a research grant from the European Research Council about thinking about the precautionary principle and unpredictability about new technology. But we have also had an industry collaboration with a reinsurance company, Amlin, which was dealing with systemic risks that emerge when you do risk modeling. But we also have had philanthropists giving us donations directly. And we've been quite lucky with that because, as you can hear, much of our research is not in the standard academic fields. We're very interdisciplinary for real, which is usually a real problem if you're academic, because typically grant organizations say that they love interdisciplinary work, but they very rarely give you money for it.
One of your areas of study at FHI is the management of low probability, high impact risks. These are things that could have a great effect on humanity and perhaps Earth in general, but that aren't exactly likely to happen. I'm sure that everyone can think of a few of these off the top of their head, but can you give some examples of ones that are of particular interest to you, or perhaps that most people might not think about?
So I think one can play around along the probability axis. So on one hand, you have the ridiculously unlikely ones that we don't need to worry about. There is a finite probability that everybody dies of natural causes tomorrow. We can calculate it, we can't do anything about it, and it's so small that it's not worth bothering about. On the other hand, we have risks that are pretty real, like nuclear war, where I wouldn't even say that the risk is microscopic. Unfortunately, it is probably a relatively macroscopic risk per year. I would guess very loosely, but maybe it's somewhere between 0.1 and 1% risk per year, which is pretty serious actually, because you wouldn't get into an airplane if you were told that, oh, it's only 1% chance that it blows up. But then we have interesting things in between, because at some point, of course, you need to stop. You need to say that beyond this point, it's so unlikely that we don't need to care about it. So, for example, asteroids are a lovely risk that we understand really well. We know the physics, we have good data, we have a dedicated community that have been working on figuring it out quite well. And even though we don't have any tools to deflect asteroids at present, we could make them if we needed to and had enough time to warn us. It's just that when you do the statistics, you realize that the total harm done to humanity by asteroid impact is so small that probably other risks dominate. So the risks that we tend to look a lot at around here are artificial intelligence and the risks from biotechnology. And this might seem strange because right now, of course, artificial intelligence is not at all able to do much harm. Certainly it might cause inconveniences and maybe economic losses if you invest in the wrong way or trust the wrong algorithm, but it's not that much of an existential risk yet. But that gets to the other aspect, the time aspect. Some risks are not the risks in the present, but might become big risks in the future. And if we act now, we can actually reduce them and cut them off. The same thing is true for biotechnology, although there the risk is already growing, and we already have in the past seen that bioweapons and pandemics certainly can cause tremendous damage. So in our areas, we tend to focus on things that are neglected. Nuclear war, for example, is not exactly a neglected risk. And we could certainly say maybe that's a bigger risk than artificial intelligence, but it still doesn't mean we should be putting our minds on that. Because typically the impact you can have on the world depends on how neglected the things you deal with are. You can do much more progress on the AI risk right now than we can do on the nuclear war risk. And similarly, climate change. There are thousands and thousands of researchers doing excellent work, and economists and activists and others. So we could, of course, try to join in, but we would just add a few extra brains. It wouldn't actually matter very much. But discovering a new risk, or discovering that certain risks are not too dangerous and we can ignore them, that is useful. So we're kind of exploring the neglected fields.
So my next question is going to be about artificial intelligence, and that transitions to it very well right there. But first, do you have an established metric as to the percent of population that would need to be eliminated, or the amount of damage to infrastructure or something for it to be worth your consideration at the Future of Humanity Institute?
We don't really have a strict metric. There have been some conversations about whether global catastrophic risks should be defined as something like that we lose more than 1 or 2 billion people, or maybe 10% of the global GDP, or something like that. But that would typically miss the point. I think it's like the classic claim about pornography. You'll recognize it when you see it. So I think one can make an argument that we don't need a very strict definition there. It's more that it's a judgment call. Existential risks are a bit different. To us, they are the risks that actually end the story or make a permanent change in humanity's situation. We can imagine, let's say, that an entire continent gets destroyed in some natural or man-made disaster, which would be a horrible thing that would be always mentioned in history books to the end of time, hopefully. But life would go on. And that is a very different thing from existential risk. So a lot of it has to do with how terminal is the risk. But also, of course, would it change the trajectory of humanity? So the problem is, of course, that it would be nice if we just had some scale, some Bostrom scale of riskiness, that we could say that, okay, anything under 3 on that scale we don't care about. But typically, the world is not neatly arranged. So we have to get into these long conversations, actually, about where does it make sense to put in your effort. Because there are also some risks that are very resistant to fixing. So it might actually be not that worthwhile to deal with them. So there are many factors that come into what you should give high priority to.
So I work in the field of artificial intelligence, and more specifically within the AI for Good movement. And you mentioned that you focus mainly on the edge cases that a lot of people aren't talking about. And there are a lot of conversations happening today about AI ethics, topics such as bias, transparency, explainability, and more. And these are conversations that I think we need to be having, but at these conferences and events that I attend, I notice a lack of discussion on AI alignment and the control problem and other related topics. And I think a big reason for this is that in many of these arenas, even among AI experts, artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence are seen as science fiction or something not worth thinking about right now. How much of your work at the FHI focuses on AI? And do you feel that there should be more attention paid to this within the AI community itself, or are they okay at this point not allocating their time and resources to that?
So around the FHI, I think more than half is in one way or another involved with AI safety research. So we have, on one hand, a technical AI safety program that is really working on tools to make smart systems behave themselves. And we have an AI governance program thinking about how does the development of AI actually shape up globally. And if some important safety ideas came up, how do you disseminate that? How do you make sure that everybody actually implements it? So we think that in general, more effort should, of course, be put into AI safety and value alignment. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one should be just focusing about the far edge. I think it's actually quite good that a lot of people are working on the early problems too. The real problem I see is that people have a tendency to think that their little corner is the only one that's valuable. So I remember having a fair bit of arguments with Joanna Bryson about this. She's very much into the view that we should be working on the near-term stuff and the long-term stuff is less important because we really need to fix the other stuff. And I have opposite view. So in one panel, I ended up saying that, well, we both agree that we need to make a parachute to jump out of an airplane. It's just that we have slightly different views on what side we want to do the suing on. But actually, probably both sides should be sewed up carefully before you jump out with the parachute. And I do personally think that you benefit a lot from having different approaches. We're learning a lot of interesting things, even from the low-level bias issues, because that are practical problems where we got actual data, and some of those solutions might be interesting inputs for thinking about value alignment. While value alignment, in all its annoying philosophical and technical and humanistic glory, also needs to be turned into something concrete, which of course is a real thing for people trying to make autonomous cars that can obey actual traffic rules. Although a traffic rule is very different from understanding human values, making something that can understand the actual rules in a human society in an actionable way is already a pretty good step. So what I think needs to be done is mostly making sure that people realize that we can actually work together on the different parts here, and that there are natural synergies.
So climate change, as you mentioned, is a major topic of conversation, and because of that, it's not one that you particularly focus on at your institute at Oxford. But where does climate change fit into the conversation for you? Where do you think it stands on the level of existential risk or catastrophic risk that we are facing?
So typically when the journalists ask me to list my biggest risks, I start with nuclear war, which is still kind of the most likely to do us in the present day. And then I get on to AI and biorisk. And then I bring up systemic risk, because climate change on its own is very unlikely to be able to kill all people. That climate change would need to make the world ridiculously hot to do that. But unfortunately, we live in a rather globalized, fragile world. So right now we're dependent on a complicated infrastructure of not just electricity and the internet, but payment systems, energy systems, food flows, etc. It's not inconceivable at all that there could be major disruptions in these systems, and that could already harm us quite a bit. There are some really scary scenarios, for example, coming out of American National Academy for Science about geomagnetic storms and Carrington events, the effects they would have if you got a multi-month breakup in the power grid. That would definitely kill millions of people. The real problem is, of course, a system can recover if there is an outside that can send in resources and help. And even if no other disaster happened, you can rebuild from the inside up to a point. The problem is, of course, that if you're very strongly dependent on things halfway across the world and you can't get to it, now you're in trouble. And even worse, if you put a lot of pressure on systems, they become more fragile. So Thomas Homer Dixon has a very nice model of how these systemic risk flow together. So in a complex socioeconomic system, you have various parts that are doing their jobs. It might be the police, it might be the healthcare system, it might be the government. But if you start putting pressure on it, the parts get less slack. They need to rely on each other much more. The police might need to call in the military to help uphold order. The healthcare system has a hard time getting resources and need help from the military to get resources. Everything gets stretched thin. And when something breaks, now you get a cascade of failures, which is a typical feature of systemic risk. But even worse, you get a multiplicative effect, because if there is a riot and people are harmed, that's bad. But if a healthcare system is also not working, now you multiply the two harms together, because now people can't get medical treatment and it's even more damage. So this kind of systemic risk is messy. It's not as neat as an asteroid impact, where we know all the physics. It involves a lot of messy questions about complex systems, politics, economics. Practically any discipline you can imagine is involved. But this is where climate plays an important role. We can envision a world that climate change has affected, so many countries are having trouble because they haven't adapted their agriculture. They might be having natural disasters problems. There might be blame going on around where different nations blame each other for not taking up the share, etc. And in such a world, if something goes really badly wrong because of a war or maybe an asteroid strike or just bad luck, now you can get an escalating series of consequences. Payment systems go down. People can't buy food. They can't even buy gas. That in turn disrupts even more agriculture and societal order. Then you get wars. Then people use weapons of mass destruction. And you don't have a cohesive way of handling that. So that way you could get a complex existential risk. The problem is, of course, this is one possible scenario I sketched out. And in reality, there are, of course, an endless number of versions of this scenario one can play around, and each of them might not look totally plausible on their own, but there is an infinite set of them. So the problem here is, can we fix these things? Well, climate change, getting that out of the way would be great, but it still doesn't fix the core problem that we have systemic risks in society. We need to do many other things. So this is a tough job, and as Karen Kullerman called it, this is kind of unsexy existential risks. We're probably better at handling risks that come from one source or very technology involved and are neat and fit into one academic discipline than this kind of just general messes.
So sticking with the topic of climate change for just a little bit longer here, in 2012, you were listed as an author on a paper that stirred up quite a bit of controversy online. The paper was titled Human Engineering and Climate Change and was published in the journal Ethics, Policy, and Environment. And this paper explored human engineering as opposed to, or perhaps in addition to, alternatives such as geoengineering to address climate change. Some of the human modifications explored included lowering birth rates, enhancing low-light vision to cut down electricity use, guiding the human diet away from meat, making humans smaller, and more. And it was very clear that this paper was simply exploring human engineering rather than advocating for it, and that human engineering would and should be voluntary. But it still caused quite a stir. What are your thoughts today on the possibility of using human engineering to address climate change?
I don't think it's a very effective way, actually. But the story about the paper is interesting. So it began when we were trying to work together with one of the climate institutes here in Oxford. And in the end, we on the bioethics side ended up writing one paper and they wrote a different paper. And we started this paper because we realized that environmental ethics and bioethics have very different ideas about what is acceptable and what works well. So in some sense, we were just testing to see what happens if we put them together. And you could argue that this is a reductio ad absurdum. It demonstrates that this doesn't work. Something needs to break or be changed. Or you could say that we're just doing academic trolling. The problem is, of course, the right kind of trolling produces a great paper. Many of the best bioethics papers are in some sense trolling the reader and forcing them to confront some annoying ethical fact, and then hopefully they will respond by writing a new paper coming up with a solution. In our case, we got more heat than light. So obviously many environmentalists generally felt this was a stupid idea. Bill McKibben, the great Luddite, said it was the most stupid climate fix he ever heard of, which warmed my heart. And of course, my libertarian friends felt like, oh, you're saying this is all going to be voluntary, but we know governments are going to impose this. That's fair, but that wasn't our point. What we didn't think about was that quite a lot of bioconservatives are also climate skeptics. So to these people, the idea of taking climate change so seriously that you might even want to change humans, that's kind of a no-no. And changing human nature is also a no-no. So we're pressing two big red buttons at the same time. So that has been my most controversial paper ever. And in retrospect, I think we went a little bit too far in riling up people. I haven't seen anybody actually coming up with anything useful about the real problem. How do we actually think about biopolitics, both for our own species and the biosphere? I still haven't seen anybody actually address that question in a useful way.
In a recent episode of this podcast, I spoke with Supervisory Special Agent Edward Yu of the FBI's Biological Countermeasures Unit, and he is primarily responsible for analyzing the threat of bioterrorism and keeping tabs on the emerging technologies that could be of concern. I discussed with him my thoughts that, while fairly unlikely, some people working in the DIY bio or biohacking communities may not have any malicious intent, but could inadvertently cause an issue on par with that of an intentional bioterrorism attack. And it doesn't really seem as though the FBI is focused much on these potential accidents. Do you have any thoughts on biology-related catastrophic or existential risk? And how do you view the distinction between intentionality and unfortunate accident?
So I have a mental model which I call the risk pipeline. So in order to get a really serious biorisk, typically you need to have an agent who has some bad motivation. It might be a very stupid motivation or it might be a malicious motivation. Then that leads them to come up with some dangerous idea. Then they convert that dangerous idea into actual genetic code, which they then convert into actual DNA. Then they insert that into an organism, they multiply the organism, they figure out a way of spreading it, they spread it, and consequences ensue. So there are a number of steps here along this pipeline, and some of them are going to be relatively tricky. So you can imagine them as hoops you need to jump through. Now, some actors are not terribly skilled, so they are going to have a hard time coming up with really bad ideas or actually implementing them. So they are going to fail probably at one of the early hoops, and most certainly later on. Other actors might, if they ever get an evil idea, be really effective at it. If you imagine a major government, if they started a program on developing some bioweapon, they would probably be competently able to do it. So the pipeline acts as a kind of filter. It filters out the weaker agents, the agents that have a harder time doing it. So while there's certainly a lot of people in the world who might at least ponder, what if I could wipe out everybody? And a small subset of them then conclude, that would actually be a good idea. That doesn't overlap that strongly with the biohackers. And most biohackers don't have tremendously big resources. So when you think along this model, you realize that the actors that are most likely to be a problem are kind of in the mid-range. There are a few big governments that could do tremendous damage, but they're not likely actors. And there's certainly a lot of extremely incompetent actors who are bad. But what I would worry more about is kind of a disgruntled postdoc of a little biotech startup trying to cut corners. And the interesting part here is that the malicious actor knows that he's doing something bad, but the dumb actor is just trundling along, and at every step has a chance of noticing, wait a minute, what am I doing? So in a sense, the risk pipeline is much longer for the clumsy actors. That doesn't prevent, of course, the clumsiness from causing all sorts of trouble. We have seen that in, for example, how mouth and hoof disease got out twice from the same lab here in the UK through an amazing set of incompetence. And this was a government biosecurity lab, yet they let it out. But I am thinking that when it comes to actual very big harm, it's most likely to be a malicious actor. And it's probably not going to be one of the biohackers, because although there are more of them, they don't have the same resources as the slightly more advanced ones. So if I were to try to watch for threats, I would try to figure out, what do I do about really disgruntled postdocs or biotech startups working on something that could potentially have worldwide effects and might be desperate to get there.
What are your thoughts in general on the increasing democratized access to the tools of science and the growth of things such as DIY bio and biohacking? Do you think it's a net positive, or do you think there's a lot of risks here that we should take into account?
So I'm very much by default thinking that we should democratize science. Everybody should have access to knowledge, be able to test the knowledge by doing experiment. And it's important to be able to create things. Being in a world that doesn't allow you to make new things or change how the world works, that is actually threatening the human spirit. But the problem is, of course, there are going to be some people who got pretty broken spirits or pretty dangerous ideas. The problem is, of course, how do you find them and how do you handle the consequences? In many cases, it's a good thing to have more biohackers simply because there are more eyes and hands to fix things. If more people actually knew about biotechnology, it would probably be much easier to detect if somebody's doing something dangerous. So it depends a little bit on the domain. There are some domains where it might be that, okay, it's enough that a lone actor does something bad and the whole world suffers. In other domains, this might not be true. I think biotechnology is relatively safe, because many of the things that are easy to democratize are also not the things that make things very dangerous. Those parts of the risk pipeline still seem to be a bit off. And we might want to focus the efforts on figuring out better security for those ones. So a good analogy might be computers. Having more people know how to program and knowing about computer security generally tends to make us safer, not more unsafe. But there might be domains where we actually need to hide information. Handling information hazards is actually something I'm doing research about right now. And it's a really intriguing problem. Because quite a lot of people think that, oh, this looks like a scary piece of information, I need to hide it. And then you get all the frisson of secrecy. And a lot of very bad self-censorship happens even in normal science, where people don't think very carefully about what needs to be out there or what actually needs to be kept secret.
I'm very fascinated by Nick Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis, which I imagine your thought and input influenced. Particularly, I'm interested in the concepts of a high-tech panopticon and turnkey totalitarianism, in which steps could be instantly taken to protect ourselves and the planet from any number of black ball technologies that would destroy our civilization. This is understandably alarming to many people. What we're talking about here is the potential of monitoring every action taken at every location on the planet, as well as the actions of humans beyond Earth. This could mean the complete loss of what we might call privacy, as well as the rise of some semblance of global governance. I myself am uncomfortable with many of these things, but understanding the vulnerable world hypothesis, I don't see many other options. A high-tech panopticon might be the way to go if we're serious about the continued existence of our civilization. What are your thoughts on the vulnerable world hypothesis and on a high-tech panopticon?
So I vividly remember when I read Nick Bostrom's first paper on existential risk back in 2003. I was sitting on the train going to a conference at Yale University, and I had a knee-jerk reaction that, oh, this is really bad, because if it's true that these risks are so bad that they motivate almost any action, oh, that's going to be used to reduce our precious liberties. And over the years I realized, actually, it sometimes makes sense to reduce your liberty a bit if you get to survive. The problem is, of course, those tools are quite often wielded in a bad way. So turnkey totalitarianism, I think it might be very tempting for a lot of governments to turn that key, not when they have a black ball technology, but just because they're annoyed. There are a fair number of governments today that claim that they have a national emergency when it's actually just some domestic issue that they care about. So the tricky thing here is, can one set up systems that work well? I think David Brin's book, The Transparent Society, is a great start for this conversation. It was very prescient. I think it was written in 1996 or so. And he argues that, first of all, it's not about democracy, it's about open societies. Societies where people can observe that something is not as it should be, convince others that this is true, and if enough people agree on that, they can change how society works. That is the important part, not exactly how the voting works or something like that. However, democracies are pretty good at being open societies, while kind of totalitarian or technocratic societies tend to become closed quite quickly. But he also observed that surveillance technology is advancing really fast. And remember, this was the mid-1990s. This was years before we had the Snowden revelations and everything. And he was just correctly observing that given current trends, we are going to end up in a world that is going to be very surveyable. And either we accept that there is a kind of one-way mirror, so governance systems can see us, but we can't see them, or we have a two-way system where we can see what they're doing and they can see us. Now, the interesting thing here is that the missing ingredient to make this livable is tolerance and accountability. You need accountability so you can actually hold your government responsible for not doing what it should be doing. And you also need tolerance, because in this very transparent world, even you will notice stuff about your neighbor, or at least other parts of the government will notice a lot of peccadillos going on in society. If you don't have tolerance but a transparent world, it's going to be a total nightmare. Little old ladies and bigots worldwide are going to be running our lives. If you don't have accountability, okay, bad things are happening, we can see that, but we can't fix them. So we need to get those components to actually make this work. Now, you might still say that, yeah, this threat is so big that now you need a system that cannot be removed. It cannot be actually held accountable once it's in charge. But that means that we're having a potential existential risk if that's badly programmed, whether that is the risk from an artificial intelligence implementing it, or some government agency that once it's in charge can never ever be unseated unless it wants to. So one needs to be very careful about this. My feeling is that most people just get so riled up about the sheer grandness and horror and potential for these things that we don't try to think more deeply about it. People quite often get into this idea that either it is transparent, total transparency, or we need privacy. But actual life is, of course, a complex mixture of both. So we have been investigating what we call structured transparency a bit, which is methods of doing forms of surveillance that actually preserve privacy. For example, a bomb-sniffing dog is a good example. It might be running around the airport, learning a lot of facts about people it's sniffing at, what they have been eating, who they have been together with, what perfume they're wearing, but it only barks when it notices a bomb. That is the important thing. It doesn't matter that the dog actually knows quite a lot of things about you. And I think one can construct many technical systems that have the same properties that could actually do enormous big monitoring of everything, but only report stuff that matters. So you could imagine, for example, having bomb detectors in all rooms. That's not an intrusion in your privacy unless you have some very peculiar ideas on what to use bombs for in your bedroom. And similarly, we might imagine using other things to try to deal with black ball technologies. The big headache here, and this is where I think people need to pursue this much more deeply, is that can we do this for technologies we have no clue about at all? It's one thing to know that we could brew up dangerous pathogens. Good, we need pathogen detectors. We need ways of quickly building quarantines and detecting bioterrorism. For AGI, it's more tricky. How do we detect when bad software is doing something? But we still have some loose ideas. But what about something totally out of the blue? That is going to be very, very tricky to construct. So to sum up my relatively long rant or micro lecture here, I do think we can start out by refining these ideas. Nick's paper is brilliant, but it's a first stab. And I think one should also give it a very charitable reading. What he's proposing is probably not the best ideas. It's the first ideas. And then we can see what we can do to build on top of them.
So, discussing the possible inevitabilities of civilization destruction is getting into Fermi Paradox territory, which of course is the conflict between the expected high probability of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe and the lack of intelligent life that we see today. It's quite possible that these undefined black ball technologies are a great filter and are the reason we are not finding intelligent life beyond Earth. The Fermi Paradox has interested me for quite a while, and you've been thinking about it as well. You've offered a paper titled Dissolving the Fermi Paradox that actually ends up making this not quite paradoxical. Can you go into that paper a bit and discuss your methodology and findings?
Yeah. So the classic way of reasoning about the Fermi Paradox is to look at the universe and notice that, wow, it's very big. There is a lot of sites where intelligence could have emerged, and there is a lot of time for it to have emerged. So if I multiply that with some reasonable probability, I ought to get a large number of civilizations out there. I don't observe any. There is something wrong going on here. Now, we know the universe is actually big, so that can't be the problem. So it's really about the probability of getting observable intelligent life. And here there is, of course, the classic Drake equation where you multiply together a bunch of factors. And typically what people do, either explicitly or implicitly, is that they have some sense of how large these factors might be. And in many papers and books, people do an informal calculation saying, yeah, we don't know this, but let's, for the sake of argument, assume it's this big. And then they multiply things together, always admitting that we're uncertain about it and that the final answer, that number, is also going to be uncertain. The problem is that's not the right way of handling uncertainty. If you ask me how many people live in Greater London, I don't know. And if I were to say 10,900,348 people, That's actually not a good description of my uncertainty. I should say, yeah, between 6 and 12 million. That range makes sense to me. And similarly, we can do this with the Drake equation. We can say that, yeah, the uncertainty about the fraction of stars with planets is pretty small. It's probably between 10% and 100% of all the stars that have planets. So we basically have an order of magnitude of uncertainty at most. And it's shrinking more and more the more observations we get to. On the other hand, what fraction of Earth-like planets could get life? Well, we can, if you survey the actual scientific knowledge about abiogenesis, we can easily get 100 orders of magnitude of uncertainty. There are reasonable arguments that would suggest that practically every terrestrial planet would develop life. And there are also arguments that also seem, given our current knowledge, reasonable, suggest that no, only one in a literal Google planets. More science will, of course, help us reduce this uncertainty as we learn more. But right now we have an enormous range of uncertainty. So if we now mathematically multiply together our estimates, even if we think our median guess is pretty optimistic, you end up with a very broad tail towards low probability. That is, we can't rule out that we're actually really alone in the Milky Way or even the visible universe, given what we currently know in science. And in that case, seeing an empty sky is not that worrisome. Yeah, it could be that life and intelligence is common and there are dangerous technologies that all intelligence develop and that kills them off. That's a possibility, but it seems like much more of a likelihood of when you try to explain an empty sky is actually coming from that, well, maybe life or maybe intelligence is really rare. And this, of course, allows us now to try to do more research to reduce these uncertainties and start to see if we can actually get a better answer. The funny thing is, this has actually moved my own views that we're probably more alone than I thought a few years ago. But it also made me much less worried about the empty sky. That doesn't seem to be foretelling our doom.
So, if that's correct, and it's likely that we are alone in the universe, how do you feel that we should react? Is this good news because it means there might not be a great filter and the fate of the universe is up to us? Or is it bad news because we are all alone and the fate of the universe is up to us?
So, that the fate of the universe is up to us is one of those awesome things which is simultaneously horrifying and awesome. It's a tremendous moral duty for us to probably not to flub it if this is true. So that is beside the point. I think the really interesting thing is loneliness. Why do we care whether we're lonely? And I think the actual answer is, well, we're social mammals. We care about not being lonely on an individual level. But on a species level, it's kind of fun. We have actually expanded our view, in some sense feeling like if there are not other species out there like us, we're feeling lonely in a collective sense, which might turn out to be totally irrelevant if we meet aliens and they're evolved from insects or something else that might not even have emotional loneliness. So while loneliness might be important for our outlook, it might actually not matter ethically in the really large. I think what truly matters is, can we figure out what truly matters? And can we then make sure we bring about good states, whatever they are, on a large scale? And it might turn out that, well, maybe it's just up to us. There is no built-in moral laws in the universe other than what we add to the universe. It might be that actually happiness is what should be optimized and we better pave the universe with happy minds. Or it might be that we should be creating complexity or doing something else, including perhaps hedging our moral bets and trying a little bit of everything without causing too much harm and suffering. So generally, I think finding that we're alone in the universe is actually not that bad news. If that is the price for knowing that we're not doomed because it's a very dangerous universe, it's actually a really good price. However, I would be delighted to actually meet some alien civilizations. But maybe it turns out that we have to become the aliens ourselves, so we have to create our own aliens.
A bit of abrupt subject change here, but you brought up transhumanism at the beginning of the conversation. This is a label that some people proudly adopt and others completely avoid. And I think this because transhumanism is becoming a loaded term with a lot of stereotypes, some accurate and some inaccurate. So, how do you define transhumanism, and do you identify as a transhumanist?
So I typically define transhumanism as the continuation of an Enlightenment era version of humanism, saying that humans matter. The human condition is good, but can become even better. And not just through education and rational institutions and so on, but also through technical means. We can directly improve ourselves biologically or our near environment. Another way of putting it is to say that transhumanism is about questioning the human condition, asking, do we actually have to sleep? Should we actually age? Couldn't we function in a totally different way? That doesn't necessarily mean that the answer is always, yeah, we should totally change everything. Quite a lot of aspects of the human condition are actually quite good or might be very risky to change. But transhumanism will and should be poking at these aspects of human condition rather than just meekly accepting them. Now, one can do this in a lot of different ways. And the main problem for transhumanism is that it doesn't on its own have a value system built in. It's not like transhumanism automatically tells you what is a good direction to go. Should we maximize happiness? Should we maximize complexity? Maybe it's up to everybody to live a virtuous life. Maybe it's important with social justice. Maybe we should be Christian or some other religion. All these things are not really built into transhumanism, but you can certainly put them in. It's totally possible to be a Christian transhumanist or a fascist transhumanist or a liberal transhumanist or whatever else. This is, of course, a real problem because that means we get a lot of transhumanisms and some of them are totally incompatible with each other. On the other hand, it also means that transhumanist ideas can exist in a lot of different forms. I can totally see environmental transhumanists and even conservative transhumanists. So normally people get confused when you mention transhumanism because either they have not heard the term and don't know what to expect, but they hear that it's an ism. And these days people are rather worried about ideologies because they know that they're dangerous utopian things that lead you to do strange things. Or they have heard about transhumanism and tend to think that their prejudices or their image of transhumanism is an accurate description of the person in front of them. So quite often I try to focus instead on the question at hand. I'm trying to say life extension is good because of the following reasons, or this is why I think we really should be managing nanotechnology better. That way I get around the issue of, is this a transhumanist view or something? I'm just saying this is a reasonable view or this is my view. And then if somebody wants to bring up and say, aren't you a transhumanist, Anders? I typically answer, yeah, I started a bunch of transhumanist organizations in my day and might have led a few of them. But still, the important things are the questions. The important things are the reasoning we can do.
So, a lot of people in the transhumanist movement are very interested in things like life extension and human enhancement. Where does the well-being and longevity of an individual life fit in with the larger picture of the well-being and flourishing of a community, society, or humanity as a whole? So, put another way, do you feel that it is beneficial for humanity for each of us to want to preserve and better our own lives? Or would it be more beneficial to accept our eventual demise and forego our own self-interest in some ways to service the human flourishing more broadly speaking?
I think you can't have collective human flourishing if you give up on the individual human flourishing. So in general, when you think about the effects of aging, it means a tremendous loss of not just the individual life, but pain and suffering for people around that person, and a loss of human capital, experience, etc. There is a tremendous loss that you can both put an economic value on, and that's a pretty big one, a moral value, and as well as just a disruption of our connection to the world. People who live longer also have a good reason to care more about the long-term future. They have a good reason to care more about their environmental impact because they're actually going to see the consequences. So I think we actually have a very good reason to try to live longer. And in fact, a long-lived society is probably actually likely to be a bit more humane society than one where people come and go very quickly and you can't actually trust anybody to stay around. in that later society, you would actually have people as interchangeable building blocks. While in a society where people develop skills and abilities and networks over a long time, they become quite a bit more precious. I think the root of this is that a lot of people tend to assume that the group is like the individual. We tend to envision that societies are like people, or that governments are having an agency that functions just like our own agency. And that doesn't actually work, because when you scale things up, it works very differently. It's not a good thing for society at large, I think, that people die. You might certainly want to have a bit of churn. You don't want the same people as president or professor all the time. You might want to have term limits. You might want to ensure that there is suppleness in the system. And there is certainly some potential here for rigidity if people just settle into a cozy situation and become ever more vested interests. But that is also something we can fix by doing social innovations. It's not dissimilar from how we handle it in other domains. So I do think that a lot of people have a slightly naive idea about what evolution or society or humanity wants. These are abstractions, and they don't have the same moral value as the actual individuals.
Building off of that a bit, are there any changes you've made in your own life to promote the well-being and longevity of yourself, or alternatively, to promote the well-being and flourishing of humanity?
So, to the later question, I guess my job is trying to, as most I can, to help humanity. But on the first question, a few years back I did 23andMe, and I was kind of expecting to find that I had a lot of cancer risk. And I was a bit surprised by realizing, I have way higher cardiovascular risk than cancer risk. I actually need to reframe here. I'm thinking about my health. And I actually did start eating healthier and exercise more, which came in handy when I got a diagnosis of hypertension, which I again could actually track down. I think I know what mutations are partially responsible for my hypertension. It's not clinically useful, but it's still interesting and made me a more active patient. I'm also using sometimes cognitive enhancers to get the extra energy, but most of the time I realize that I can actually get that by sleeping really well. So I also tried using metformin, which in healthy people seems to have somewhat beneficial effects, and relatively mild side effects, and it's cheap. So I've done that to improve my health, and I think the overall effects have been positive. Other than that, I'm not very radical when it comes to life extension. I'm of course signed up for cryonics, but I think that right now we still don't have quite the tools necessary to really slow down aging or repair aging damage. Certainly, if I were older, I would start looking into things like rapamycin and senolytics. But right now, that's a bit too risky for me. Right now, it's more about eating my greens and exercising. And in general, of course, the way to help humanity, I think, is to recognize that, I'm a part of the universe, I'm part of the biosphere, I'm a part of society. Let's see what I can do as a part here. It's not all about me. I think that if there was anything useful I could learn from the Doctor Strange movie, that is actually that kind of thinking is quite effective. When you're not thinking about yourself, then it's much easier to get into a flow state and actually get stuff done, and that feels great.
You mentioned there's some potential cognitive enhancement that you've done before. Are you able to share what you've used or what your methodology is for that?
So I tried various cognitive enhancers. Since I've been writing about the ethics of cognitive enhancement, I felt like I ought to test it in order to see what I'm talking about. And today, my mainstay is that every day, of course, a fair bit of caffeine, which is just simple and practical and socially very acceptable. For days where I really need to focus and get energy, modafinil. As an alternative to modafinil, I'm sometimes chewing very small amount of nicotine chewing gum. It's interesting because I find that I'm very sensitive to nicotine and it works in a different mode. I can't take a stimulant several days in a row. That wears me out. So it's rather that I should select a day where it actually makes sense to be effective. Now, it took me a number of years before I even dared trying modafinil. I was offered it many years back and I politely declined because I was worried, what if I get addicted? I've been very concerned about both my brain health and the potential for addictiveness. But over the years, I read up more and more about it and found that, yeah, the profile looked pretty safe and good. Again, from a blood pressure standpoint, taking stimulants is maybe not the smartest thing, but if I don't do it every day, it actually seems to be pretty manageable. Now, the problem I have is, of course, what else could I do to improve my brain capacity? So many of the other cognitive enhancement people talk about, there is not that much good scientific evidence for. And I rather not risk anything by taking stuff that somebody on Reddit came up with and got sent something from a Chinese factory. So ideally, we need to work, of course, on changing the attitudes to regard enhancement a valid medical activity and actually allow people to both do experimentation, but also allow companies to develop proper enhancers. Long-term memory enhancement, various Alzheimer medication have been used for long-term memory. I haven't tried because I realized that my long-term memory is good enough. And in fact, many other possible enhancements might not be particularly useful for us simply because it's not the particular bottleneck. So in my case, it might be that I tend to get sidetracked easily. So things that focus my attention so I keep on one task longer has a very big effect. But for other people, it might be working memory or it might be long-term memory. So I think my advice to anybody who wants to enhance themselves is to first examine what we're doing and try to see what is it that actually holds them back and what can you do about it. And sometimes that might be a course in time management or the right calendar software or in training oneself into mnemonics. It doesn't have to be a pill. In fact, it might be more practical to get other techniques. And another interesting observation I made is that observing one's mental processes, especially when they get enhanced, allows one more easily also to get back into that state. So I certainly observed myself when I've been enhanced and then just keep on doing the same thing out of habit, which is very practical and cheap, and I don't have to take a pill to do it.
Are there any policy changes that you think should be enacted on a local, national, or even more of a global scale that could really help solve humanity's problems going forward?
So a small one, but certainly not an entirely easy one to implement, is of course to do more randomized controlled trials of policy. This is tricky because people are fine with doing that about policies they don't care about. But everything that people care about, they are suddenly convinced that, of course, you don't need to do a proper trial. And actually running a trial that could perhaps show them wrong, that's suddenly immoral. So that means that we can do randomized controlled trials to figure out how to get people to respond better to doctors, but not to improve schooling. But I think we need to work very hard on changing these attitudes because actually doing proper research on improving policy is quite powerful. The problem here is this mainly works, of course, in domains where we can agree that the outcome actually is an improvement. And in many cases, there is no such way of agreeing because it's all a matter of values. So generally, I think we need to work both on decentralizing many of our systems. It's quite risky, as I mentioned earlier, to have a highly integrated globe where some server breaking in China can mean that I can't communicate. You want to decentralize, and that's going to be costly. There is a good reason why we centralize things or why we outsource things to very remote systems or put them into the cloud. And you have to pay an externality for not doing that. But the externality of being too enmeshed is, of course, that you have a risk externality. And becoming more aware of that and realizing that in order to reduce the collective risk or the synchronous correlated risks that affect a business or an entire society, we might actually want to pay a bit extra because it's worth it in the long run. I think that is going to be an important one. Typically today, when people are risk averse, they try to reduce risks directly and typically go for the symbolic risks rather than the actual risks. But actually trying to figure out ways of making safer systems and accepting that that's going to cost a bit, that's going to be very useful. Similarly, I think more open access to data is another useful building block. And we need to build better tools. And that's probably not public policy so much from the government side as public policy from a civic society side. to actually investigate this. There is a brilliant paper by Bruce Schneier looking at the attack surfaces of democracies and autocracies. And he points out that in a democracy, if you start doubting the knowledge system built into the society, who's responsible for things, what is actually true, that destabilizes the democracy quite strongly. On the other hand, autocracies, they thrive in that situation because the people with power can still impose their power. They don't care if people are believing in conspiracy theories or not, because they can just force things. However, they are vulnerable to truth. They're vulnerable to people being able to actually communicate with each other and actually figure out what the actual state of the world are. So I think it behooves us very much as intellectuals, as citizens, to construct systems for finding out the truth, for disseminating the truth, for actually filtering the noise, conspiracy theories, fake news, and gossip in a useful way. And we shouldn't trust that to be done in a centralized manner because the failure modes are pretty severe.
So I'm conscious of your time limits here, so just a few more questions before we wrap up. What do you read and follow? Do you have a book, article, or other media suggestions for anyone? Are there any publications that you consistently check?
So I do read The Economist quite a bit, because if nothing else, that tells you what ideas are kind of acceptable to a certain group of international people and institutions. I also try to read relatively widely news stories from very different news media to get a sense of what's moving in other domains. And of course, the main scientific journals like Science and Nature and the PNAS. But other than that, I'm very eclectic. I like to have a broad spread and try to see what can I find in the domains I haven't been exploring so much. So I try, for example, when I travel, to buy used textbooks in university bookstores and at least try to read the introduction for random topics before going to bed. That way I get a little bit of knowledge about what's known in different disciplines. I'm also, of course, very fond of science fiction. So fond of the writings of Charles Stross or Hannu Rajaniemi and Greg Egan. And I think, again, science fiction has this interesting role of both spreading really interesting ideas and scenario plans, but also opening minds. My mind might be already so open, my brain might be falling out. But being able to conceive of radically different scenarios, not just telling the standard stories in a space setting, but actually thinking about scenarios that could never happen unless we change some key thing about humanity. That is very useful to get a transhuman mindset. Then you want to go over and read the hard physics books and actually realize how darn hard it is to build a working fusion reactor, or the really annoying problems with radiation in space. But that interplay between, on one hand, the free-floating fiction and the vision of what we might want to achieve and build versus the hard facts of reality, and then the scenario building we can do in between, that is what's really driving a lot of my research.
What are you working on and thinking about now? Are there any papers or projects in the works?
So my enormous project right now is writing a book. I call it Grand Futures. And basically, it's the opposite of thinking about existential risk. This is about existential hope. Existential risk is the possibility that the future might not hold any value. Existential hope is the future might actually be bigger and better than we thought. So I'm trying to, in this book, analyze what do we know about how good the future could be along various dimensions. So that includes questions about post-scarcity, how materially rich and wealthy can we be, sustainability, how long could we survive on Earth in a sustainable way, could we extend the lifespan of the biosphere, of course settling the solar system, from the early questions of is it actually biologically possible for us to live in space, over to how to construct and maintain your Dyson sphere. And then, of course, another chapters about interstellar settlement and even intergalactic settlement. And then over to the ultimate questions about what does the law of physics allow us to do? How much computation can we do? How far can we go in space? Can we change space-time? Are there forms of value that we have not yet discovered? At the end, the book turns into philosophy, where I'm analyzing in terms of different value theories what we ought to be doing. And then hopefully manage to turn this back into the question, so in the present, what should we be aiming for? Some things are fairly obvious, like the astronomical waste argument, pointing out that given how long and great the future could be, and that we're at the start of it, we should make sure we don't lose it all by going extinct or something like that. But there might also be important questions that we need to research before we start spreading out and can't coordinate. There might actually be an important role for us right now, because we're 1/7 of a second away from each other on Earth right now, as the light speed limit puts us. That allows us to coordinate, and we still can coordinate for maybe a century or so. But beyond that, we might be too spread out to actually do grand coordination. So we might need to solve certain problems, to set certain things in motion very soon.
That sounds like a very interesting book, and I can't wait to get my hands on that when it comes out. And it also sounds like a very optimistic book. But last question here, are you personally optimistic? What do you think is most realistic for the future of humanity?
So I'm very optimistic, and partially that's probably just a genetic predisposition. I'm a very positive person, regardless of circumstances. So I'm very aware that I'm, of course, biased to always see the nice possibility, etc. But as we like to say, the pessimist is quite often right, but doesn't get happier for that, while the optimist is quite often wrong, but is still cheerful. So at least from a psychological standpoint, this is useful. And optimism is, of course, useful to drive us to do things. Because if you think the future could be great, then you have a reason to try to safeguard it. And if you also think that you can do something about it, again, you have a reason to do something. If you're feeling more pessimistic about these chances, then you might actually not want to act very much. So in practice, I think the realistic assumption is the future is going to be just as inconsistent and messy as the present. If we think about the current world, in many ways is the best thing ever. More people are alive than ever before. They're more educated, they're wealthier, they're living a wonderful life, in many ways more peaceful than ever. And at the same time, we have existential risk threats, we have glaring, horrible injustices, we have some very horrible governments around, etc. And this is the messiness that we end up with. I'm pretty certain that by the point we become some post-human society, we are going to have post-human problems. We are going to be really annoyed by things that we today can't even imagine. And there are going to be some threats that really keeps the post-humans up at night that we can't conceive of. But at the same time, they have solved, or at least partially resolved, many of the things that keep us up at night. So I like to think that the monkeys, considering to evolve into humans or post-monkeys, might say, yeah, if we become super intelligent, we will be able to get as much bananas as we can imagine. And we, the humans, are indeed able to get way more bananas than the monkeys. It's just that we discovered other things that are more valuable, like sports, art, science, philosophy, and we're doing that instead of getting just an enormous amount of bananas. The monkeys might think that we have failed it to some extent, but we know that we have higher values. And I think in the future we might do the same thing. Post-humans might actually know that, yeah, we're doing a lot of awesome science and philosophy and sports, but we have these other concepts you humans can't understand that are even more important and valuable. And by the way, occasionally we have a banana.
That is very reassuring to hear that someone who studies catastrophic and existential risk for a living is optimistic about the future, and it makes me feel much better. So thank you for sharing that. I think this was a great conversation. You know, we could have done an entire episode on any of these individual topics, so there's so much more to go through probably at a later date, but I learned so much from just this conversation itself, and I can't wait to get it out there. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you. This was wonderful.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Anders Sandberg. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We also need your help to keep this podcast running. You can donate at futuregrind.org/support or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. Till next time, this is Future Grind.